Page 58. With darkness, one soul rose wondrously from among the new slain dead and stole away in the moonlight. The ground where he'd lain was soaked with blood and with urine from the voided bladders of the animals, and he went forth stained and stinking like some reeking issue of the incarnate dam of war herself. The savages had moved to higher ground, and he could see the light from their fires and hear them singing, strange and plaintive chanting up there where they'd gone to roast mules. He made his way among the pale and dismembered, among the sprawled and leg-flung horses. He took a reckoning by the stars and set off south afoot. The night wore 1,000 shapes out there in the brush, and he kept his eyes to the ground ahead. Starlight and waning moon made a faint shadow of his wanderings on the dark of the desert, and all along the ridges the wolves were howling, moving north toward the slaughter. He walked all night, and still he could see the fires behind him. With daylight, he made his way toward some outcroppings of a rock a mile across the valley floor. He was climbing among the strewn and tumbled boulders when he heard a voice calling somewhere in the vastness. He looked out over the plain, but could see no one. When the voice called again, he turned and sat to rest, and soon he saw something moving along the slope, a rag of a man clambering toward him over the talus slides. Picking his way with care, looking behind him. The kid could see that nothing followed. He wore a blanket over his shoulders, and his shirt sleeve was ripped and dark with blood, and he carried that arm against him with the other hand. His name was Sproul. 8 of them had escaped. His horse had carried off several arrows, and it caved under him in the night, and the others had gone on, the captain among them. They sat side by side among the rocks and watched the day lengthen on the plain below. "Did you not save any of your possibles?" Sproul said. The kid spat, shook his head. He looked at Sproul. "How bad is your arm?" He pulled it to him. "I've seen worse," he said. They sat looking out over those reaches of sand and rock and wind. "What kind of Indians was them?" "I don't know." Sproul coughed deeply into his fist. He pulled his bloody arm against him. "Damn if they ain't about a caution to the Christians," he said. They laid up in the shade of a rock shelf until past noon, scratching out a place in the gray lava dust to sleep. And they set forth in the afternoon down the valley following the war trail. They were very small, and they moved very slowly in the immensity of that landscape. Come evening, they hove toward the rim rock again, and Sproul pointed out a dark stain on the face of a barren cliff. It looked like the black from old fires. The kid shielded his eyes. The scalp canyon walls rippled in the heat like drapery folds. It could be a seep, said Sproul. It's a long ways up there. Well, if you see any water closer, let's make for that. The kid looked at him and they set off. The site lay up a draw, and their way was a jumble of fallen rock and scoria and deadly looking bayonet plants, small black and olive colored shrubs blasted under the sun. They stumbled up the cracked clay floor of a dry watercourse. They rested, and then they moved on. The seep lay high up among the ledges, Vadose water dripping down the slick black rock and monkey flower and death commas hanging in a small and perilous garden. The water that reached the canyon floor was no more than a trickle, and they learned by turns with pierced lips to the stone, like devoutes at a shrine. They passed the night in a shallow cave above this spot, an old reliquary of flint nappings and rachel scattered about on the stone floor with beads of shell and polished bone and the charcoal of ancient fires. They shared the blanket in the cold, and Sproul coughed quietly in the dark, and they rose from time to time to descend and drink at the stone. They were gone before sunrise, and the dawn found them on the plain again. They followed the trampled ground left by the war party, and in the afternoon they came upon a mule that had failed and been lanced and left dead. And then they came upon another. The way narrowed through rocks, and by they came to a bush that was hung with dead babies. They stopped side by side, reeling in the heat. These small victims, 7, 8 of them, had holes punched in their underjaws and were hung so by their throats from the broken stumps of a mesquite to stare eyeless at the naked sky. Bald and pale and bloated, larval to some unreckonable being, the castaways hobbled past. They looked back. Nothing moved. In the afternoon, they came upon a village on the plain where smoke still rose from the ruins, and all were gone to death. From a distance, it looked like a decaying brick kiln. They stood without the walls a long time listening to the silence before they entered. They went slowly through the little mud streets. There were goats and sheep slain in their pens, and pigs dead in the mud. They passed mud hovels where people lay murdered in all attitudes of death in the doorways and floors, naked and swollen and strange. They found plates of half-eaten food, and a cat came out and sat in the sun and watched them without interest. And flies snarled everywhere in the still hot air. At the end of the street, they came to a plaza with benches and trees where vultures huddled in foul black rookeries. A dead horse lay in the square, and some chickens were pecking in a patch of spilled meal in a doorway. Charred poles lay smoldering where the roofs had fallen through, and a burro was standing in the open door of the church. They sat on a bench, and Sproul held his wounded arm to his chest and rocked back and forth and blinked in the sun. "What do you want to do?" said the kid. "Get a drink of water. Other than that, I don't know. You want to try and head back to Texas? I don't know where else. We never make it." "Well, you say. I ain't got no say." He was coughing again. He held his chest with his good hand and sat as if he'd get his breath. "What have you got, a cold?" "I got consumption." "Consumption?" He nodded. "I came out here for my health." The kid looked at him, shook his head, and rose off across the plaza toward the church. There were buzzards squatting among the old carved wooden corbels, and he picked up a stone and squirreled it at them, but they never moved. The shadows had grown long in the plaza. Little coils of dust were moving in the parched clay streets. The carrion birds sat about the topmost corners of the houses with their wings outstretched in attitudes of exhortation, like dark little bishops. The kid returned to the bench and propped up one foot and leaned on his knee. Sproul sat as before, still holding his arm. "Son of a bitch is dealing me misery," he said. The kid spat and looked off down the street. "We better just hold up here for tonight." "You reckon it would be all right?" "With who with?" "What if them Indians was to come back?" "What would they come back for?" "Well, what if they was to?" "They won't come back." He held his arm. "I wish you had a knife in you," Kid said. "I wish you did." "There's meat here if a man had a knife." "I ain't hungry. I think we ought to scout these houses, see what's all here. You go on. We need to find us a place to sleep." Sproul looked at him. "I don't need to go nowhere," he said. "Well, you suit yourself." Sproul coughed and spat. "I aim to," he said. Kid turned and went on down the street. The doorways were low, and he had to stoop to clear the lintel beams, stepping down into the cool and earthy rooms. There was no furniture save pallets for sleeping, perhaps a wooden meal bin. He went from house to house. In one room, the bones of a small loom black and smoldering. In another, a man, the charred flesh drawn taut, the eyes cooked in their sockets. There was a niche in the mud wall with figures of saints, dressed in dolls' clothes, the rude wooden faces, brightly painted. Illustrations cut from an old journal and pasted to the wall, a small picture of a queen, a gypsy card that was the Four of Cups. There were strings of dried peppers and a few gourds, a glass bottle that held weeds. Outside, a bare dirt yard fenced with ocotillo, and a round clay oven caved through, where black curd trembled in the night within. He found a clay jar of beads and some dry tortillas, and he took them to a house at the end of the street, where the embers of the roof were still smoldering. And he warmed the food in the ashes, and he ate, squatting there like some deserter scavenging the ruins of a city he'd fled. When he returned to the square, Sproul was gone. All about lay in shadow. He crossed the square and mounted the stone steps to the door of the church, and he entered it. Sproul was standing in the vestibule. Long buttresses of light fell from the high windows in the western wall. There were no pews in the church, and the stone floor was heaped with the scalped and naked and partly eaten bodies of some 40 souls who barricaded themselves in this house of God against the heathen. The savages had hacked holes in the roof and shot them down from above, and the floor was littered with arrow shafts where they'd snapped them off to get the clothes from the body. The altars had been hauled down, and the tabernacle looted, and the great sleeping god of the Mexicans routed from his golden cup. The primitive painted saints in their frames hung crooked on the wall as if an earthquake had visited, and a dead Christ and a glass beer lay broken on the chancel floor. The murdered lay in a great pool of their communal blood. It had set up into a sort of pudding, crossed everywhere where the tracks of wolves or dogs. Along the edges it had dried and cracked into some burgundy ceramic. Blood lay in dark tongues on the floor, and blood grounded the flagstones and ran into the vestibule where the stones were cupped from the feet of the faithful and their fathers before them, and it had threaded its way down the steps and dripped from the stones amongst the dark tracks of the scavengers. Sproul turned and looked at the kid as if he'd known his thoughts, but the kid just shook his head. Flies clambered over the peeled and weedless skulls of the dead, and flies walked on their shrunken eyeballs. "Come on," said the kid. They crossed the square in the last of the light and went down the narrow street. In a doorway, a dead child with two buzzards sitting on it. Sproul shooed his good hand at the buzzards, and they baited and hissed and flapped clumsily, but they did not fly. They set forth in the morning with first light, while wolves slank from the doorways and dissolved in the fog of the streets. They went by the southwest road the way the savages had come. A little sandy stream, cottonwoods, 3 white goats. They waded a ford where women lay dead at their wash. They struggled all day across a terra damnata of smoking slag, passing from time to time the bloated shapes of dead mules or horses. By evening they had drunk all the water they carried. They slept in the sand and woke in the cool, early morning dark and went on, and they walked the cinder land until they were near to fainting. In the afternoon they came upon a carreta in the trace, tilted on its tongue, the great wheels cut from rounds of a cottonwood trunk and pinned to the axle trees with tenons. They crawled under it for shade and slept until dark, and then they went on. The rind of a moon that had been in the sky all day was gone. They followed the trail through the desert by starlight. The Pleiades, straight overhead, and very small, and the Great Bear walking the mountains to the north. My arm stinks, said Sproul. What? My arm stinks. You want me to look at it? What for? You can't do nothing for it. Well, suit yourself. I aim to, said Sproul. They went on. Twice in the night they heard the little prairie vipers rattle among the scrub, and they were afraid. With the dawn, they were climbing among shale and whinstone under the wall of a dark monocline where turrets stood like basalt prophets, and they passed by the side of the road little wooden crosses, propped in cairns of stone, where travelers had met with death. The road winding up among the hills, and the castaways laboring among the switchbacks, blackening under the sun, their eyeballs inflamed, and the painted spectra racing out of corners, climbing up through Ocotillo and Prickly Pear where the rocks trembled and sleered in the sun rock and no water and the sandy trace, and they kept watch for any green thing that might tell of water, but there was no water. They ate pinole from a bag with their fingers and went on, though the noon heat in the dusk where lizards lay with their leather chins flat to the cooling rocks and fended off the worlds with thin smiles and eyes like cracked stone plates. They crested the mountain at sunset, and they could see for miles. An immense lake lay below them, the distant blue mountains standing in the windless span of water in shape of a soaring hawk and trees that shimmered in the heat, and a distant city were very white against the blue and shaded hills. They sat and watched. They watched the sun drop under the jagged rim of the earth to the west, and they saw it flare behind the mountains, and they saw the face of the lake darken and the shape of the city dissolve upon it. They slept amongst the rocks, face up like dead men, and in the morning when they rose, there was no city and no trees and no lake, only a barren, dusty plain. Sproul groaned and collapsed back among the rocks. The kid looked at him. There were blisters along his lower lip, and his arm through the ripped shirt was swollen, and something foul had seeped through among the darker bloodstains. He turned back and looked out over the valley. "Yonder comes somebody," he said. Sproul didn't answer. The kid looked at him. "I ain't lying," he said. "Indians?" said Sproul. "Ain't it?" "I don't know. Too far to tell." "What do you aim to do?" "I don't know. What happened to the lake?" "I couldn't tell you." "We both saw it. People see what they want to see." "Well, then how come I ain't seen it now?" I sure as hell want to." The kid looked out over the plain below. "What if it's Indians?" "Likely it will be. Where can we hide at?" The kid spat dryly and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. A lizard came out from under a rock and crouched on his small cocked elbows over that piece of froth and drank it dry and returned to the rock again, leaving only a faint spot in the sand, which vanished almost instantly. They waited all day. The kid made sorties down into the canyons in search of water, but he found none. Nothing moved in that purgatorial waste save carnivorous birds. By early afternoon, they could see the horsemen on the switchbacks coming up the face of the mountain below them. They were Mexicans. Sproul was sitting with his legs outstretched before him. I was worried about my old boots lasting me, he said. He looked up. Go on, he said. Save yourself. He waved his hands. They were laid up under a ledge of rock in a narrow shade. The kid didn't answer. Within the hour, they could hear the dry scrabble of hooves among the rocks and the clank of gear. The first horse to round the point of rock and pass through the gap in the mountain was the captain's big bay, and he carried the captain's saddle, but he did not carry the captain. The refugees stood by the side of the road. The riders looked burnt and haggard, coming up out of the sun, and they sat their horses as if they had no weight at all. There were 7 of them, 8 of them. They wore broad-brimmed hats and leather vests. They carried escopetas across the pommels of their saddles. As they rode past, the leader nodded gravely to them from the captain's horse and touched his hat brim, and they rode on. Sproul and the kid looked after them. The kid called out. Sproul had started to trot clumsily along behind the horses. The riders began to slump and reel like drunks. Their heads were lolled. Their guffaws echoed amongst the rocks. They turned their mouths and sat them and regarded the wanderers with huge grins. "Que quiere?" cried the leader. The riders cackled and slapped at one another. They had nudged their horses forward and they began to ride them about with that aim. The leader turned to the 2 afoot. "Buscan a los indios?" With this, some of the men dismounted and fell to hugging one another and weeping shamelessly. The leader looked at them and grinned, his teeth white and massive, made for foraging. "Loonies," said Sproul. "They're loonies." The kid looked up at the leader. "How about a drink of water? Drink of water," he said. The leader sobered. He pulled a long face. "Water?" he said. We ain't got no water," said Sproul. "But my friend, how no? It's very dry here." He reached behind him without turning, and a leather canteen was passed across the riders to his hand. He shook it and offered it down. The kid pulled the stopper and drank, and stood panting and drank again. The leader reached down and tapped the canteen. "Basta." He hung on, gulping. He could not see the horseman's face darken. The man chucked one boot backward out of the stirrup and kicked the canteen cleanly from between the kid's hands, leaving him there for a moment in a frozen gesture of calling. And with the canteen rising and turning in the air and the lobes of water gleaming about in the sun before it clattered to the rocks, Sproul scrambled after it, and he snatched it up where it lay draining and began to drink, watching over the rim. The horseman and the kid watched each other. Sproul sat back, gasping and coughing. The kid stepped across the rocks and took the canteen from him. The leader kneed his horse forward and drew a sword from its place beneath his legs, and leaning forward, ran the blade under the strap and raised it up. The point of the blade was about 3 inches from the kid's face, and the canteen strap was draped across the flat of it. The kid had stopped, and the rider raised the canteen gently from his hand and let it slide down the blade and come to rest at his side. He turned to the men and smiled, and once they began to hoot and pommel one another like apes. He swung the stopper over from where it hung by a thong and drove it home with the heel of his hand. He pitched the canteens to the man behind him and looked down at the travelers. "Why you no hide?" he said. "From you? From I. We were thirsty. Very thirsty, eh?" They didn't answer. He was tapping the flat of his sword lightly against the horn of his saddle, and he seemed to be forming words in his mind. He leaned slightly to them. "When the lamb is lost in the mountain," he said, "they is cry. Sometimes come the mother. Sometimes the wolf." He smiled at them, raised the sword and ran it back at where it had come from, and turned the horse smartly and trotted it through the horses behind him. And the men mounted up and followed, and soon all were gone. Sproul sat without moving. The kid looked at him, but he would look away. He was wounded in an enemy country, far from home, and although his eyes took in the alien stones about, yet the greater void beyond seemed to swallow up his soul. They descended the mountain, going down over the rocks with their hands out held before them, and their shadows contorted on the broken terrain, like creatures seeking their own forms. They reached the valley floor at dusk and set off across the blue, cooling land. The mountains to the west, a line of jagged slate set endwise in the earth, and the dry weeds healing and twisting in a wind sprung from nowhere. That's page 69.